This is great. We've got people up there in the stalls. I'm Adam Banks, Janet Rice. We're your hosts for the Oscars this evening. I want to acknowledge, first of all, the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri, and pay our respects to their elders past and present, and to acknowledge any elders who are here in the room with us tonight. I want to acknowledge some of the MPs that we've got here. I can see Greens Victorian Leader Greg Barber, and of course Richard Di Natale, Victorian Senator, who's about to be joined very shortly by Janet Rice in the Senate as well. I especially ask you to just keep clapping for Richard Di Natale and his office, who have organised this fantastic event. If there's any other MPs here, stick up your hand and we'll acknowledge you. We've got some fantastic guests tonight: Tim Flannery, Bob Brown and David Lindenmayer. And you're also going to hear from representatives from environment groups around Victoria. And I want to thank some of those, in particular My Environment and the Green Institute, who are helping us to webcast this event live on YouTube. And Mr. Rob Gill, who generously gave his time earlier to host the live stream. Please, round of applause for Rob. I want to welcome those of you who couldn't make it here tonight but are watching it at home. And if you've got any questions for our speakers, we will also be taking questions from Twitter using the hashtag Extinction later in the evening. But tonight, as you know, we're going to be hearing from three of the country's foremost environmentalists about the grave threats facing our environment, and in particular, the beautiful old-growth forests of the Toolangi and the Hills Guru.
Thank you, Adam. And I'll reiterate, as Adam has said, how wonderful it is to be here with you tonight, talking about forests, talking about the environment, talking about possums in this election campaign. Certainly, I find it particularly moving because my journey to being here tonight as your lead Senate candidate began many years ago when I was a founder of the Greens on the back of having been sold out by the Labor Party on forests. After 7 years as an East Gippsland Forest campaigner, and decided we couldn't trust Labor on forests. We needed the Greens to be able to stand up for our environment, to stand up for our forests, and stand up for our possums. So tonight we're going to hear the story of how the Victorian State Government is logging some of the Leadbeater's possums' last remaining habitat in the Victorian Central Highlands, and how this logging is driving this endangered animal to extinction, and how there are only fewer than 1,000 possums now remaining in the wild. The sad story of Leadbeater's possum is a perfect example of what happens when the federal government hands over its environmental powers to the states, and a perfect example of why we need stronger federal environment laws and why we need a very strong system of national parks and reserves. Tonight, you're going to hear about the threats facing Leadbeater's possum and its habitat, what these threats mean for the future of Victoria, its economy and the environment, and what we can do to stand up to these threats. Our first speaker tonight is Professor Tim Flannery. Tim is one of Australia's leading thinkers and writers. He's an internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer and conservationist. And Tim's books include definitive ecological histories of Australia, and he's published more than 100 peer-reviewed papers. As a field zoologist, he has discovered and named more than 30 new species of mammals, including 2 tree kangaroos. What a wonderful thing to have in your CV. And at 34, he was awarded the Edgeworth David Medal for outstanding research. His pioneering work in New Guinea prompted Sir David Attenborough to put him in the league of the world's great explorers. And the writer Redmond O'Hanlon remarked, he's discovered more new species than Charles Darwin. Tim Flannery was named Australian of the Year the day before Australia Day on the 25th of January 2007. He's currently the Chief Commissioner of the Australian Climate Commission, and as a professor, he holds the Panasonic Chair in Environmental Sustainability at Macquarie University. I'd like you to join with us to welcome Professor Tim Flannery.
Could I just begin by thanking each and every one of you who've come here this evening for caring for your country in the way you do and for taking time out to demonstrate that this evening. A few short years ago, we wouldn't have needed to do something like this, I suspect, because back then, good stewardship, which is what we're advocating this evening, was something that people from the left and the right both agreed was necessary. And it was indeed the honourable and right thing to do. The creation of our national parks estate, the protection of many endangered species, was all achieved during that period when good stewardship was just common sense. I'm really saddened to have to stand here tonight in an environment where that is no longer recognised. The fundamental problem that we've got is that our governments are not being accountable for their responsibility to protect our biodiversity. It's a legislated responsibility. And there is perhaps no greater example than this, no clearer example than that of Leadbeater's Possum. I became engaged with this, indeed I'm here tonight really courtesy of David Lindenmayer. I'm here to support him as much as anything. And he, when he wrote that the current regulatory framework, the current legislation, the current policy settings are guaranteeing the extinction of this unique species in Victoria. I just saw that as fundamentally wrong and fundamentally immoral and something that we need to be heard on. We need to do far better than that. Leadbeater's possum's an extraordinary mammal. I studied mammals when I was a scientist, and Leadbeater's possum was one of the ones that really fascinated me. In some ways, it's a living fossil. It's a member of the gliding possum family, which broke away early enough in evolution that it never developed gliding membranes. It's a real curiosity in a natural history sense. The lineage is probably 10 million or more years old, and through that time, the tall forests of eastern Victoria, the eastern half of Victoria, have provided a refuge for it through periods of climate change, through periods of great geological change and upheaval. And tonight, we are thinking about that possum at quite literally the 11th hour. We've seen its decline since human settlement in Victoria on a massive scale. Its extinction in places like the Great Kuirup Swamp, where it was first described, through huge areas of its habitat. Until today, it is entirely possible that unless we change our way, we will be the last generation to know that species is a living animal. And that is an intolerable situation. If we look at how we're dealing with extinction as a whole in Australia, we can hardly be proud. We're one of the wealthiest, most educated nations, least populated nations on the planet, and yet when you look at our legislated obligation to save endangered species, we've done miserably. Only a single species in the history of endangered species legislation has come off the endangered species list. That was the saltwater crocodile. The rest have lingered on the list for 20 years or more, and very little has been done to improve their status. We do know, however, that if we do act, we can make a difference. 2 wallabies would now be either extinct or almost extinct in the wild were it not for individual action. That's the marla and the bridle nail-tail wallaby. We've seen the natural populations dwindled over the last decade or two until they have virtually gone. We've watched the extinction of the Christmas Island pipistrelle, another mammal, just over the last couple of years because action was too slow to be taken. This is hardly a modern pattern. Back in 1914, Professor T.T. Flynn said the thylacine in Tasmania was so endangered that they needed to be transferred to an offshore island. If action had been taken then, and some thylacines had been put on Maria Island, as he suggested, perhaps we'd still have the thylacine today. So we know we need to act. We know we can act. We simply need the political will to do so. We need a sufficient love of country and love of our heritage to do what is right and what is common sense. Having said that, I shall hand over, I think, to the man who can tell us exactly what needs to be done.
If we could light up that talk, please. Okay, thank you very much for coming out tonight. It's extraordinary to see so many people here over what just seems to be a possum, but in fact, Leadbeater's possum is emblematic of a failure of government policy at the state and federal level. Leadbeater's possum is emblematic of a forest in a stage of collapse. Leadbeater's possum is emblematic of an ecologically unsustainable forest management regime at the moment. And it is an animal that we can save if we make the right kinds of interventions. The science is so strong and so compelling for what we have to do. The science has been accumulated over 30 years. We know what has to happen. The science shows us what has to happen. Now we need governments to grow a spine and do that and show what can change when there's a will to do so. And one of the key things that we need to do is to remember that mountain ash forests have probably been here for 40 million years. Leadbeater's possum has probably been around for 10 to 20 million years. The thing that has changed demonstrably in the last 50 years is industrial logging, which has changed the forest, which has changed fire, and is sending this animal on an extinction trajectory. And what I'm calling for tonight is a change to take out the key threatening process in this system, which is clear fell logging, and create the Giant Forest National Park. And I want to argue the case for why that is so important, not only for this animal, not only for the forest itself, but also for climate change, for Melbourne's water supply, for the tourism industry, for rebuilding local communities, and showing what can be done with good policy and good interventions. The case for the Giant Forest National Park is absolutely compelling. We've worked on this, and others have worked on this for 3 decades. 7 books, over 180 scientific articles reviewed in the scientific literature, over 800,000 scientific measurements in this forest. And there are 2 very special people, David Blair and Lockie McBurney, that work every day of the week in these forests to this day. Very important. The Giant Forest National Park is critical for a whole range of reasons, not only to conserve Leadbeater's possum and biodiversity, but most of this city's water supply comes from these forests. It's critical to protect the water supply of what will soon be Australia's largest city. These forests are the most carbon-dense forests in the world, and we'll see in a moment that it's critical to think about these forests in terms of conserving that carbon and avoiding emissions. It's critical for limiting future fire. We know that logging makes these forests more fire prone. The evidence is unequivocal. We know that there is enormous potential tourism capability from these forests. Over 4 million people just an hour and a half's drive from the MCG to these forests. People, I'm sure, from Melbourne will want to flock to see these forests, and from overseas to see these amazing places. And I think that's critical for rebuilding some of these local communities and creating a new infrastructure that allows these people from all over the world to experience these magnificent places. These are the tallest flowering plants in the world.
This is a photograph of me in this system. Absolutely extraordinary forests. I have no doubt that with some sensible creation of tracks, walking tracks, people will want to experience these forests while maintaining their integrity for water supply, maintaining their integrity to make sure that they're not reburned, and allowing lots of people to appreciate what an extraordinary resource this is. Not a resource that we liquidate in 1 year and then it's gone for decades and decades and decades to come. This is a resource that can keep giving in terms of its economic value, its environmental value, its wood value for carbon storage for years and years and years to come, not to mention its biodiversity value and other values. We know that these forests are under enormous pressure and they have been changed massively in the last 50 years. Industrial logging has demonstrably changed these forests. At the time of white settlement, somewhere between 30 and 60% of these forests would have been old growth. Now what has happened is the vast majority of that old growth forest is gone. We calculate that now only 1.16% of mountain ash forest is old growth. That's only 1,886 hectares out of a total of 161,000 hectares. Why does that matter? It matters because old forests are where we have the most carbon stored. Old forests is where we have the most large old trees, which are critical habitat for Leadbeater's possum. Old forests are where we get the most water. Old forests are where we have the highest tourism value. If we look at alpine ash, the situation is even worse. 0.37 of 1% of the alpine ash forest estate is old forest. That is outrageous in any circumstance, from any perspective. There is no way that that forest could be deemed to be being sustainably managed under the regional forest agreement process. There's no way that that forest could be certified under Forest Stewardship Council approaches. No way that we could consider that these forests are being managed in a sustainable way. The mountain ash forest is emblematic of totally unsustainable forest management over the last 20 to 30 years. And Leadbeater's possum is a symptom of poor environmental management, no questions about it. 60,000 hectares of forest were burned in 2009, yet the successive state governments have worked on a policy of no net loss to industry since that's occurred, despite that much forest being burnt. That is really quite extraordinary, that you can continue to maintain massive pressure on that forest resource without any change, which means that the remaining green forest is being liquidated even faster than it was previously, and Leadbeater's possum is going to be driven on an extinction trajectory. We need to do something about that. If we look, for example, at the timber release plan, 412 clear felling coops, 17,655 hectares of forest in that timber release plan for the next 5 years. That is outrageous, given what has happened to the forest, not only after the 2009 fires, but even preceding that, for 2 decades prior to the fires, it was well known that the forest was being over-harvested even then. It was widely known when I worked for the Victorian government from 1990 to 1992, even back then. Clear fell logging changes forest environments so that they remain unsuitable habitat for Leadbeater's possum for at least 150 years. At least 150 years. Next slide, please. I wanted to give you an idea of what's actually happening in this system. You can see the logged areas here in red, what's going to happen under the timber release plan, and the areas of green forest that are left over that haven't been cut. This includes logging in water catchments over the recent time. I do not want anybody to listen to the present rhetoric which says that we only log 0.6 or 0.8 of 1% of the forest estate in any given year. You need to look at this in terms of the mountain ash forest, and you need to look at what's happened to this forest in the last 50 years or so. In fact, going back to the 1900s, more timber came out of Port Melbourne than came out of Seattle, from a much larger catchment in North America than we have in Victoria. These forests have been under massive pressure for over a century. And what we see now is the legacy of poor environmental decision making over many decades. Not just this government, not the previous government as well, but the ones before that and before that and before that. Next slide, please. We can also see the massive changes to these forests as a consequence of fire. So fire and logging have had a massive and drastic change on this system. Has shifted the forest from being 30 to 60, perhaps even as high as 80% old growth to roughly 1% old growth. Next slide, please. What we have been able to show, and work by ourselves and others has shown this quite clearly, that extensive and intensive clear felling makes these forests more fire prone. Now this is very controversial, but the evidence for this is very strong, and there's further work to be published on this in the next few months. But essentially what we see is that very young forests for the first few years are less likely to burn, and then for the next 40 to 50 years these forests are much more likely to burn, and burn at much higher severity, and burn over a much larger area of these environments. Mountain ash forest is not alone in this. We see the same kinds of problems in the boreal forests of North America, the tropical rainforests of Asia, South America, and elsewhere. We see the same kinds of problems in the wet forests of the Pacific Northwest of the USA, northeast of the USA, and southeast of the USA. Logging makes these forests more fire prone. A very important and very concerning outcome, given how much forest has been logged in recent times. Next slide, please. Leadbeater's possum is clearly on an extinction trajectory. The reserve system is inadequate. This is well known. Other people have been working on this, and we've also been working on this. We can change this. There is hope, there is time, but we need to make the right interventions and make them soon. The science shows what we have to do. Again, we need to make sure that our politicians grow a spine and do this because it's so important to do. Next, please. This is the trajectories. On this side we see the numbers of species of possums and gliders in relation to the number of big old trees. And the more of these big old trees we have, the more of these species we have. Leadbeater's possum shows the same kind of relationship. We have seen this over and over and over again for the last 30 years. Here we have the present trajectory for the number of large old trees in this system under no fire or logging, the natural collapse, under logging, and then fire as well. This system is in a state of near collapse. We have to change the key threatening process which is changing this system. We have to reduce this. We have to reduce the amount of logging, and we have to comprehensively change what we're doing in this system. The evidence is clear. The evidence is very, very strong. These are the most carbon-dense forests on the planet. We have looked at this very carefully. Heather Keith and Brendan Mackey and others have looked at this painstakingly over many years. Next slide, please. What we see from Heather Keith's work is a breakdown of what's happening. So if you can think of this in terms of 100% of the amount of carbon stored in this system, 60% after logging is waste or slash that lies on the forest floor and starts to decompose. Paper products is only 20% of that 100%, and it has a very short period in the carbon cycle before we have emissions. Timber, sawn timber products, is 4% of that 100%, a tiny amount. And it's horrifying to think that a lot of that sawn timber is actually carting beer bottles around, yes, as pallets, an extraordinary use of ash timber. Next slide, please. More importantly, to think about what happens when we do cut these forests, when we change them from being an old forest to a younger regrowth forest. We're losing about 600 tonnes of carbon per hectare when we do this, above ground biomass. Calculations done by Heather Keith indicates that about 100,000 hectares of mountain ash, if it were to be retired and moved into a national park, would save about 21.5 million tonnes of carbon emissions over a 50-year rotation. That's equivalent to about 1 million hectares of revegetated land. an extraordinary number. A change that could be made with a stroke of a pen to change that system to a giant forest national park. An extraordinary contribution to issues to do with climate change, an extraordinary contribution to tackling all sorts of issues with how forests should be addressed in terms of the issues that we're dealing tonight. Next slide. The water values of these forests are colossal. Remember, most of the water that people drink in Melbourne, 4.5 million people, comes from these forests. We know that these forests in an old growth state provide far more water and much higher quality water than young regrowth forests. We also know that the water values far exceed the paper pulp values and the timber values from these forests. The evidence for that is absolutely unequivocal. We also know that Melbourne now has a clear price signal on water through the desal plan. And so the comparison between the value of the water and the value of the timber and the value of the pulp is clear and distinct. It's absolutely transparent what we should be doing with these forests, and it's not turning them into paper. Next slide, please. We've looked at this. My father-in-law was a manager for Melbourne Water, actually in its previous iteration, the Melbourne and Metropolitan Water Works, as a chief engineer for several decades. And we've written a book which is soon to appear on Melbourne's water catchments and why it's so critical to maintain these catchments as forests as old as possible to produce the most water as possible, and to also not use desal plant when we can possibly avoid it. A critical value for a critical resource. Next slide, please. So there are major benefits of a giant forest national park. Absolutely major benefits. There are benefits for biodiversity, not only Leadbeater's possum, but many other species. There are major benefits for carbon storage. There are major benefits for water yields. There are major benefits for tourism, and clearly there are major benefits for trying to control fire, particularly in a rapidly changing climate. Next slide, please. The tourism benefits, I think, are really quite extraordinary, and we are really sitting on the edge of a gold mine here. Less than an hour and a half's drive from the NCG. Other places have done this, like in Tasmania. Extraordinary outcomes in terms of changing the whole fabric of places like Geeveston in southeastern Tasmania, with some tourism infrastructure and some creative thinking about what to do. Other places have done this, like in Milford Sound in New Zealand. This is something that people come from all over the world to do. We need to create that infrastructure to help develop regional economies and communities that really value these forests for the extraordinary places that they are. Other people have begun to think about where this reserve will be, how big it should be, what it should contain, why it should be where it is. To conserve habitat for Leadbeater's possum, to provide connectivity from the important habitats to other areas of the environment, to protect the last areas of old forest, to protect the important parts of water catchments, to make forests less fire prone, not more fire prone, and to create a really important ecotourism and regional economic powerhouse for these areas. Absolutely critical. It can be done. Other areas have done this. The models are well and truly tried and tested, and it's time to do this kind of thing in this state. The Giant Forest National Park case is utterly compelling. We know where it must be, we know where it has to be, we know why we need it. The science is absolutely unequivocal, and we need to do this. We must do this. It's critical for Victoria, it's critical for Leadbeater's possum, and it's critical for so many other reasons. And I really hope that this state will grasp this extraordinary opportunity and make the decisions that it really has to make to capitalise on this extraordinary resource. Thank you very much.
of acting and what we can really gain from acting to protect those magnificent forests. We missed out on introducing David before his talk. David is a Professor of Ecology at the Fenner School of Environment and Society at ANU and is widely regarded, as you can tell from tonight's talk, as one of the world's leading ecologists and conservation scientists. And now it's my job to do the introduction for the person that is the epitome to this audience, I think, of the person who doesn't need an introduction. But I'm going to do it anyway. I think I was talking with Bob at lunchtime today, and we were thinking about the fact that we probably first met in this very hall. I think it was one of the very early meetings in Melbourne, the first big meeting in Melbourne at the beginning of the Franklin campaign in 1979. There are other people, anybody else in the audience who was here at that 1979 Franklin campaign meeting? Yes! And of course, Bob has had an amazing career since then, as well as being one of the founders of the Wilderness Society and one of 1,500 people arrested in the Franklin protests, and elected to the Tasmanian State Parliament while still incarcerated in Hobart's Risdon prison. So Bob's role in the Frontier is very well known. He then founded the United Tasmania Party, the first Greens party in the world, which then went on to become the Australian Greens and the Global Greens. And again, when we were bringing the Victorian Greens into being here over 20 years ago, I remember Bob being over here like a shot when we were talking about possibly forming the Victorian Greens. So huge support to the Greens formation across the country and across the world. He spent 10 years as a member of the House of Assembly in the Tasmanian State Parliament and was elected to the Senate in 1996. In his first speech to the Senate, he raised the threat posed by climate change, and government and opposition members laughed at his warning of sea level rises. And it's taken them 10 years to finally begin to acknowledge, if they do it at all, the causes and effects of climate change. And since that time, 1996, Bob has continued to take a courageous and often politically lonely stand on issues across the national and international spectrum. Some of the many issues that Bob raised in the Senate include petrol sniffing in Central Australia, self-determination for West Papua and Tibet, saving Tasmania's ancient forests, of course, opposing the war in Iraq, justice for David Hicks, stopping the sale of the Snowy Hydro scheme, and opposing the dumping of nuclear waste in Australia. Bob was re-elected to the Senate in 2001, and following the election of 4 Green senators in 2004, he became the parliamentary leader of the Australian Greens in 2005. He was elected for a 3rd term in 2007. And in 2010, Bob led the Australian Greens to an historic result when more than 1.6 million Australians voted Green, and we elected 9 senators and added to the House of Representatives. As a result of this election, as we know, the Greens had balance of power in the Senate and signed an agreement with the Labor Party which allowed Prime Minister Julia Gillard to form government. And a key part of this agreement was the Greens' requirement that a price on carbon be introduced, which led to this legislation being passed at the end of 2011. Bob stepped down as the leader of the Australian Greens and then retired from the Senate in June 2012, but he remains an extraordinarily active and generous presence in Australia's environment movement. So I'd like you to welcome Bob.
Senator Janet, Senator Richard Di Natale. It's just lovely to be here back in Storey Hall after so long ago. 1979, this place was packed like it is tonight. I was so nervous I could hardly breathe. But it was the start of a campaign which galvanised the country and which led to a massive area of Tasmania's wilderness with the Franklin River flowing through it being protected. And tonight, in that wilderness, instead of snuffed out by a couple of 100 feet of water and a series of 4 dams, due to popular action, the ringtail possums are calling. The boobook owl is also calling. The platypuses are feeding in the rivers and the creeks leading into it, and the lakes. The wedge-tail eagles are getting ready for the new breeding season. The whole ecosystem is there, robust, strong, as it has been for thousands, indeed millions of years, and cultural sites, where the oldest cultures, the last ice age, the southernmost people in the world were living in the caves along the Franklin, has been protected by just one thing, and that is popular action. People taking peaceful action to protect it. And what we're about here tonight is to realise David Lindenmayer's dream of a great forest national park. And while elections are always run on GNP, you've put an F into it, David. We now have GFNP, and I'm in favour of this concept for this nation. I know Brew and Transfer had a little bit of a good time with Christine Milne raising the issue of Leadbeater's Possum during the campaign. Did you see that last night? And did you hear the gasp from the crowd when the final thing shown there was the possum itself? One thing we learned from the Franklin campaign, and David's done it beautifully here, and we've had brilliant portrayals of this in the meantime on other areas which have been protected, is to allow those areas to speak for themselves. But here we are in a city of 4 million people, as Tim and David have pointed out, with the age of guardianship seeming to have gone. It's disappeared somewhere. And yet just to the north in those ranges is this remarkable, I'm so old that I can remember the last time Leadbeater's possum was extinct. And I remember with delight at the end of my high school years when it was announced it had been found again, hadn't been extinct at all. And I can't tell you what a thrill I got from this news coming out way back there in the 60s, 100 years after it had been first described and then lost. And we're on a mission here which is critically important, and that is to see that this magnificent creature going back 10, 20 million years goes forward with us human beings into a future where we've regained the philosophy of living with each other and with all our fellow species. You know, when a giant asteroid smashed into the planet 65 million years ago, all the dinosaurs went to extinction. There was down in a hole, they tell me that if that happened again, the temperature over here would be somewhere between 300 and 700 degrees centigrade 3 days later. No wonder the dinosaurs found they're going tough. But down in a hole there somewhere were some rat-like little marsupials. And from those marsupials which survived this Holocaust have come Leadbeater's possum and us. We come from the same ancestry. And miraculous as that is, let us for goodness sake not be the ones that knock them out these millions of years later. Well, I want to talk in a moment a little bit more about what we can do, and I'm taking my hat off here tonight to the people of Toolangi. I thank David for taking me up to, Paul and I, up to the Yarra Ranges on a blast of a winter's day last year. It was so cold even the possums didn't put their noses out. But up to that brilliant forest, you saw it there. These are the tallest flowering trees on earth, and one of these is still recorded in the Guinness Book of Record, is mountain ash, as the tallest tree ever measured in human history, 134 metres high. And they're growing back to that height after the disasters of the last century, if only we protect them. And as we saw in those slides, they need to be more than 100 years old or more than 150 years old for the Leadbeater's possum to find nesting places in them. Branches fall out, the old trees are there. This is essential if you're going to get regeneration of this magnificent creature, along with a whole range of other marsupials and birds in these wondrous forests. What is it about us? I was down the street in London in 1970 and I said to a lady getting along, "Madam, could you tell me where St Paul's Cathedral is?" And she said, "No, I've lived here all my life and I can't tell you, Sonny." I've never forgotten that. Well, I'm not going to ask how many people here have been up to see the world's tallest flowering forest, just north, an hour and a half north of this city. But what is it that lets us take for granted the grandeur of the greatest living entities ever on the face of the planet, which is what the mountain ash forest is? I'll come back to that in a moment, because just over Bass Strait, I don't know why Leadbeater's Possum didn't get over there. Perhaps they knew the forestry Tasmania was coming. Whatever it is, we have the Tarkine rainforest in similar parlous situation. Extraordinary thing about that is John Howard protected it after a tussle with Mark Latham in the 2004 election from logging. But now there's 57 or 59 mineral exploration licences, and the current Labor ministers for the environment have been the protection that the Australian Heritage Council recommended, and given this year the go-ahead for the first 2 open cut mines in this magnificent region. If we can see the picture, please. Whoever knows how to press that button. I'm technologically challenged, but I'm sure it's coming. And I was just there on the weekend, on Sunday. Have a look at this.
The Tarkine Wilderness is in the northwest of Australia's island state of Tasmania. While unknown to many Australians, in 2013 the Tarkine was honoured by CNN Travel in the United States as #1 on its list of the top 10 remote places on the planet. Named after the Tarkina people who lived along its coastline for thousands of years before European dispossession, the Tarkine is rich in Aboriginal heritage. This includes the sites of huts, like this one on a scenic coastal knoll, ancient engravings like these on shoreline boulders, and numerous stone implements. Even older is the Tarkine's natural heritage. This is the global stronghold of rare and endangered species like the Tasmanian devil, the spotted-tailed quoll, the world's largest freshwater crayfish, and Tasmania's wedge-tailed eagle. These giant eagles have a wingspan of up to 3 metres. The Tarkine's coastline is blasted by the roaring 40 winds, which bring it the cleanest air on Earth, and in winter, waves 5 stories high, which pound the rocky outcrops. In summer, the Tarkine's beaches are patterned by the amber waters of rivulets, which drain the buttongrass plains further inland. Further east, in the ancestral lands of the Tomagini people, is Australia's largest temperate rainforest. This ancient rainforest decks the mountainsides, as well as the Tarkine's pristine, west-flowing rivers. In 2004, the Howard government put an end to logging here. Then, in 2013, the Australian Heritage Council advised the Gillard government to protect the whole of the Tarkine by placing it on the list of Australia's national heritage. But Environment Minister Tony Burke rejected this advice and opened 96% of the Tarkine, including most of its rainforest, to mining exploration. Burke then gave his go-ahead for a first open cut mine in the Tarkine's so-called protected area. The mining company plans to gouge a hole more than 1 kilometre across and 250 metres deep. There are 55 other applications for mineral exploration, including in the rainforest heartland. The Tarkine should be protected for its obvious World Heritage values. One powerful thing stands between that World Heritage listing and the mining trash bag for the Tarkine, and that is public opinion. You can help. Write to your federal MP, donate to the Save the Tarkine campaign. Or better still, visit the Tarkine yourself. Go for a walk, photograph a waterfall, enjoy a cruise, or simply relax in the Tarkine Wilderness Lodge before taking a morning stroll in the rainforest. Because to go to the Tarkine is to want to save it. And together, we can.
Storm with horizontal hail, and they measured the wind gust just up the way at Craig Grim of 157 kilometres an hour on Sunday, with those giant waves pounding the shores, and then with a little band of 25 greenies in beanies have a cavalcade of 200 to 300 four-wheel drives go past yelling abuse from the pro-mining side, was to realise how the tables have tipped. It reminded me so much of being up at Telangi last year. And what is it that has 4 million of us in this city, or 200,000 in Hobart, unable to say we are going to step off the footpath to protect these areas because they are sensational, because they are inspiring, because they make us creative creatures, because they give us adventure, because they remind us of our own ancestry in this biosphere. Are we such a comfortable society just concentrating on GNP that we simply cannot get our mind around GFNP? I wonder about that. I wonder if it is that the Wednesday specials are just too important for us to really consider what we could do if we instead spent the money on saving the forests of the ranges north of this city and the rainforests just across Bass Strait south of this city. You know, there's a lot to be done there. What I recommend, if you haven't in your area, if you don't know of anybody who's working on saving Leadbeater's possum and working for this Central Highlands magnificent park, it'll be a huge component of the future of Victoria. Like the Great Ocean Road, how could you come to a city like this and pick up a brochure for the tallest flowering trees on earth with all those creatures in it and not want to go there? That's what's going to happen if we work for it, ladies and gentlemen. So if you can, go there in the next 12 months. Make a commitment to go and have a picnic up there and see the splendour we've now seen on the screen here tonight. Because it's true that to go there is to want to save it. That's what's happened to me. That's why I'm here tonight, because David kept insisting. And he's asked, I think, the leaders of all the other political parties, and they haven't gone. But I'm a Green, and I did go. And I know that in the Parliament we will have the Greens working in the coming years with the community to protect what's left of these great forests. And that brings me to September the 7th. You know what day that is? Yeah. It's National Extinct Species Day. Don't allow your vote to be a vote for extinction on Saturday week. And let me tell you, if you vote, I'll be explicit, if you vote Labor or Coalition, you are voting for the extinction of those creatures because they will not have enough forest left to live in. If you vote for the Greens, you're voting for their persistence into our future. It's as simple as that. And that's what democracy is about. But whatever you vote, ladies and gentlemen, September the 7th will come and go. Looks like we're going to have an Abbott government. It's committed to giving that EPB seat, that Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act powers back to the states. And you know why that is, because the corporate sector knows if it can get environment powers back to the states, it more easily can trounce the environment. This is going back to pre-Whitlam years. This is going back to mid-last century. And where is it on the agenda? I've seen it on, what's it called? Gruen Transfer. Really? On a funny show. And thank God it was there, because it was such a good little segment. But where is it in the serious debate? In the ABC. I mentioned in the Age today, thank goodness, and they've had some good articles in the past. But where is the environment and the fact that the shorthand, green tape, getting rid of green tape, is longhand for saying please vote to trash the environment, to trash those forests, to march Leadbeater's Possum faster to extinction. So ladies and gentlemen, think seriously about that. I was going to say a little earlier, if you can form a little group, half a dozen people in your neighbourhood, working to protect Leadbeater's Possum, working for this great forest national park for Victoria, that matters. That will get local coverage. That will get other people interested. But the first thing to do, if you do form such a group, or you join a group that's working already to protect these forests, is to go there and see it. Reward yourself at the outset. It rewarded me. I love the place. It's fantastic. You have to put the disaster of what's happened to these forests to the side to work for the extraordinarily important result we now have to keep what's left. And when we do, we know we're on the road to keeping Leadbeater's Possum from extinction. The same as we know if we can protect the tarkine, we're on the road to preventing the Tasmanian devil, whose stronghold it is, from marching to extinction. So September the 7th, ladies and gentlemen, is Extinct Species Day. Let's make it Prevent Extinction of Species Day. Thank you.
I think that we have truly heard from three extraordinary individuals today. We've heard from Professor Tim Flannery, who has spent his life documenting the diversity of life on Earth and standing up to make sure that it's protected. And we've heard from David Lindenmayer, who has spent much of his life learning about these magnificent old growth forests that are right here on our doorstep in Melbourne and standing up to make sure that they're protected. And from Bob Brown, who started a political movement to stand up for the same aims, a national political movement that's now turned into a global political movement. And because I and many others in this room have been lucky enough to stand on the shoulders of giants and people like Bob, it's great that we are now here in Melbourne, that politically speaking is the greenest place in the country. You might just have to go a little bit further up into Fitzroy, where at the last election at one of the booths there, the Green vote came within 100 votes of meeting the total of Labor and Liberal combined, but we're pretty close right here at RMIT. And so that's why it's such a thrill and a pleasure for me to announce tonight, right here from the heart of Green Melbourne, and especially to you, David, that as the Deputy Leader of the Greens, we are 100% behind the push to create the national park right here in Victoria. And very shortly, you're going to have the opportunity to ask these great individuals some questions in our Q&A session. But I'd like first of all to invite Sarah Rees to come up and join the panel and to tell us a little bit about herself.
second most humbling moment of my life. The first was the day we entered the Supreme Court to protect the Leadbeater's possum in the forest of Toolangi after the 2009 fires. And there are many people to thank. I work for a group, My Environment. I'm the director of that group and have lived in these forests for the last 15 years. I had to bring all the names with me, and I really want to thank everyone who has been involved with the protection of these forests. Warburton Environment, the Wilderness Society, Lawyers for Forests, Friends of Mount St Leonard, Healesville Environment Watch, the Central Highlands Action Group, Healesville Sanctuary, the Knitting Nanas, the Environment Defenders Office, and the Victorian National Parks Association, the Australian Conservation Foundation, Friends of the Earth, and many, many more. Friends of Leadbeater's Possum too, if I didn't mention them. So I just want to say there are so many also individuals to thank. This is a campaign that's run for, I can at least recall the last 12 years, but I think Greg Barber and David Lindenmayer might say that it's actually probably run for much longer than that, Greg Barber being one of the early campaigners. Do come out and see our forests. We spend a lot of time out there surveying. We know these forests intimately. And I think for many of you, I'd like to see a show of hands. Can I see a show of hands on who has actually been out to the Central Highlands forests in this room? That's fantastic. So get there a second time, grab a picnic lunch and come out. And there will be lots more events coming up over the next 12 months. It's a state government we need to convince as much as a federal government. And I'd just like to say quickly also, Bob, we did invite you to come out, and thank you so much for spending the time with us in Toolangi that time. And Janet Rice as well has come out to spend time with us over many times. And David has taken trips with Lee Rhiannon. And again, Larissa Waters, another one who spent enormous hours and effort getting the Threatened Species Senate Committee up, for which we've had an opportunity to discuss the Leadbeater's possum. So really, enormous thanks for everyone who's involved in this campaign, and it really every day we just keep pushing, and we will win this. We will achieve this. We will achieve it in the courts. We already have. We will achieve it with the people. The towns are already changing. Post Black Saturday, we needed to transform our towns. We needed to diversify our regional economies. These are new jobs we're talking about. So thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, Sarah. Absolutely, we will win. Yes, we can. So now, it's time for some questions. So we're going to be taking questions tonight, both from all of you wonderful people here in Storey Hall, but we've also got lots of people watching live on YouTube. So we'll be taking questions from the floor. We've got 2 roving mics, I think, which there's one there and one on the other side. And also from our Twitter stream. So if you can't get to a microphone, you can, get there virtually, and you can tweet your question to the hashtag Extinction. So we've got some ground rules. We would really appreciate if you kept your questions short, because we've got a lot to get through, and realising that because of the number of questions, we're probably unlikely to get to everyone. So let's start. Okay, so how are we going to do this?
I'm from Toolangi, thank you. I want to know how we get the national park. How are we going to do it?
I'm not sure if that's on. It doesn't matter. I'll use my voice anyway. The way that you get this very important national park is many-fold. Many people will have very different roles.
Thank you. One of the things you have to do is write